What an injury-filled week 3 we just endured, and that can only make setting our lineups even more challenging than they once were. Before setting those lineups ahead of our week 4 fantasy matchup, join Scott Soltis, known as the Professor IDP, and I, as we talk about some players we really like, some players that we're fading this week, and a couple of players we just can't figure out heading into the week 4 matchups. If that sounds like something for you and your IDP teams, then sit back, listen in, and let's get after it on this edition of the IDP After Show.
This is the IDP After Show.
Let's jump right into these names that we have this week, Scott. Being the defensive line guru that you are, I'm really interested to see that who you have as a defensive lineman that you're really excited about heading into week 4.
I couldn't help myself. So not only do I love the defensive lineman, but I got my start just talking about defensive tackles in super degenerate leagues that you needed to stream defensive tackles. And one of the player that I still find myself writing up a lot for my weekly DL streaming articles is Chris Jones. Chris Jones is incredibly under rostered. He's available in at least 50% of IDP leagues, both on the sleeper platform and on the MFL platform. And how I know I'm higher on him than most is I looked up his percentage that he's being started in sleeper, 3% this week. So only 3% of IDP leagues are starting Chris Jones. And granted, some of those are very, very thin leagues. We're only starting 1 or 2. But still, it's just ridiculously low for one of the best defensive linemen in the league. Definitely one of the best defensive tackles in the league. When I was putting together all of my D-line streaming that I do every week, I actually run my metrics across the entire population of players. So I have, the 20 that I pick out that are under rostered that I talk a little bit about, but I have ratings on everybody. I have Jones as my defensive tackle 2, and he'll be my defensive lineman 18 in my rankings this week. So the reason why I understand some of the trepidation about him is he only had 1 tackle last week. Luckily, it was a sack, so it bailed you out if you started him. But there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic. One, he's Chris Jones. We've seen him do it time and time and time again. And so doubting him is something you do at your own peril. He is out there perpetually on the field. He is one of only 8 defensive linemen, so edges and interior defenders. One of only 8 players in the NFL on the defensive line this season that has over 100 pass rush snaps through just 3 weeks. So he's on the field. He's getting opportunities. He has had, lower metrics in terms of PFF grades than we're accustomed to seeing with him, but he is still someone who I think is in a prime position for a good week this week, in part because of the matchups. So the Chiefs are playing the Ravens in another big marquee Chiefs game like they seem to have every single week. But even though the Ravens have been a tough defensive tackle matchup, if you look back to week 1 against the Bills, Ed Oliver dropped 30 points on them. So even though they're not really allowing that many fantasy points to defensive tackles, it is possible when they face an elite defensive tackle for that player like a Chris Jones to score heavily on them. And one of the advanced metrics I absolutely love in PFF is QB pressures generated. So how often a QB is running themselves into trouble or just waiting too long and is generating pressures. And Lamar has generated more pressures than any quarterback in the NFL through 3 weeks. So regardless of how the offensive line is playing, regardless of game script and all those kinds of things, Lamar Jackson is a sackable quarterback who puts himself in a position to be sacked more than any other quarterback so far through a couple of weeks. So Chris Jones is someone who I am absolutely willing to take a shot on here in week 4.
And I see Chris Jones as being a player that he only needs 1 play, like you said. His 1 play last week was a sack, so he kind of bailed you out. But that's like kind of who Chris Jones is. He's got that big play in him that kind of turns the momentum of the game. So he's a real-life great NFL player, but he's also a fantasy asset too, because whether you're playing in big play leagues or the big 3 scoring, those are the types of plays that reward you for starting a player like Chris Jones. And I'm surprised that he's only started in 3% of leagues. Do you think that's because of the stigma that sometimes goes with defensive tackle versus defensive end in leagues?
Absolutely. So in sleeper, as you're well aware, it's defensive linemen. They don't separate out defensive tackles from defensive ends. If they did, then we'd be able to see, more leagues that require defensive tackle, and I'm certain his number would go up. But there is a bias, and some of it's warranted. Some by and large, the sack leaders in the NFL tend to be defensive ends, and defensive ends tend to outscore defensive tackles. But you get to a point where enough is enough, and we don't need to be starting the 18th or 19th or 23rd best defensive end over arguably one of the top 3 defensive tackles. And like I said, my defensive tackle 2 for the week in Chris Jones, because you mentioned he's always one play away from being viable. The fact that he's one play away and he's playing a higher snap share than many defensive ends at 90, 92% a lot of weeks shows me that, hey, this is a guy I am more than willing to have starting in all of my leagues, even over some of the defensive ends.
Well, one defensive end that he definitely has more snaps going into the season and the games is my call this week. I like Dorance Armstrong of the Washington Commanders. I don't know what's not to like about Armstrong this season. He's really checking all the boxes for me right now, early in 2025. He's playing 130 snaps of a possible 230 for the Commanders, which is north of 30% or 50% of snaps, which is low compared to players like Chris Jones and Max Crosby's. But those are elite outliers, I feel, when it comes to that position. He's probably closer to the norm when it comes to snaps, not only per game, but per the season. In those 130 snaps a season for Armstrong, he's been super efficient with 14 pressures, 4 hurries, which have resulted in 3 sacks this season. He does have a 3-game sack streak that he's collected a sack in each of the last 3. He has a chance this week of making it 4 in a row against the Falcons, although Penix is a really tough sack. Atlanta's offensive line is pretty solid too, but the chance is there. Armstrong isn't just big play dependent, which gives him a nice floor. He's racked up 9 solo tackles this season. He has 4 assists through the first 3 games. So unlike a player that is only going to get you points if he gets a sack, Armstrong has kind of insulated his value a little bit because of the tackle efficiency and tackle floor. His PFF scores this season have been really good. He's gotten some nice green shades going for him this time of year, which, as fall is starting to turn, we see some autumn colors in some of those PFF metrics. But with Armstrong, we're still seeing some green. I don't see him losing any snaps to anyone on this team. He's got literally no one to siphon snaps from him. The next closest player on the team, he's more than doubled their snap share this season. So for me, Armstrong should have probably made this list last week. It would have made me look really good, especially since he had a sack last week. But he's kind of going as that DL3 ranked, the end of the DL3, 35, 36 ranked, but he's outproducing that ranking week in and week out. And so, Scott, are you with me with firing up Armstrong this week, or is this the week to fade him because he's playing Atlanta?
I'm with you. Armstrong has been in my DL streamers 2 of the first 3 weeks of the season, so I'm a big fan of Armstrong. This week, I opted for Daron Payne over Armstrong in terms of a recommendation. And you're right, Penix has not been sacked, but every quarterback gets sacked at some point. So, right. That's going to be a regression to the mean. Even if he doesn't end up getting sacked too often, it's going to happen. And if I was a betting man, which occasionally I might be on some sack props, it would be Armstrong or Payne are the 2 most likely candidates because they are the every down defensive linemen. And they're the ones who have definitely the chops and the talent and the track record. Armstrong, especially this season, Payne more long-term than necessarily already in 25 here. But I'm behind it 100% cosign.
Perfect. And the thing I like about the Falcons matchup, not only are they coming off a game that they should have won versus Carolina, but I think that's going to kind of put a little more added pressure on Penix to maybe hold the ball a little longer to make those throws. And if not, he still has that heavy volume of tackles that he's probably going to see a ton of Bijan Robinson. And so we could see like a nice tackle floor with a lot of opportunities getting tackles there. So again, I just like that insulated value. And if I'm starting Armstrong as my, in a start 4 league, I'm really happy if he's my third option. He's probably a fringe if you're only starting like 2 defensive ends, but we got the bye weeks coming up, so this might be a week maybe to roster and stash Armstrong, so you're kind of a week ahead of the game because bye weeks are coming next week. So
man, that's wild too that those are those are upon
Yeah.
us already. And
We're at the quarter post of the season, which is crazy to think about. Like it just seems like we just had the draft and we had preseason, and now we're like a fourth of the way through the season already, and we're already like thinking like, hey, my team is 1-2, my team is 0-3. Am I contending? Am I pretending? What kind of moves do I need to make? It's crazy that here we are already. It's the most ridiculous season because with baseball and basketball we get so many more games, so like to kind of see how things go. And now here we are. We're not even in the first month of football, and we're already a fourth of the way through the season. So crazy.
Yeah. I feel bad for those teams that are getting a bye already, though. I mean, that can't be.
Yeah.
I would hate to have a week 5 bye. That seems very very non-advantageous to me to then have to have that super long stretch afterwards. But
Yep.
be interesting to see.
Especially if you're a team that's thriving right now. If you're playing well, you just want to keep the gas down and going. So that's a tough ask.
Yeah, I do wish my Bengals could have like 4 or 5 consecutive buys right now, just to, really hit reset and let Joe get at least a month of that healing done. But I don't.
Too soon.
We'll talk more about
Scott.
that later and how I'm unfortunately pouncing on that from an IDP perspective. My real life suffering.
That's too soon. I had Burrow in way too many leagues, and it was like, spending fab to get Browning was not on my bingo card for this season. So.
Yeah, no, we were talking earlier. Today is my son Theo's 11th birthday, and he's a giant Bengals fan. And one of the things that I got him, I hope he doesn't listen to this, is a Joe Burrow Bengals football card tin. And I didn't give it to him because I was like, it's too soon. He'll probably cry if he sees it. I'll hold that in the bucket until Christmas when hopefully he's back on the field. But right now, I don't want to bum him out, so I gave him a Micah Parsons one instead, and he was real happy to see that one.
Well, at least the second option was a good one for him. So
yeah.
Hopefully Theo gets a nice Christmas gift, and as fantasy managers, we get Joe or Burrow back by Christmas time. That would be great too. So
yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to take us off on.
No, that's okay. No, I was just thinking you're a Bengals guy, so I was going to ask you too. Like, if the Bengals are floundering, do they even bother bringing Burrow back at the end of the season just to play 2 or 3 meaningless games, or do they just say, "Let's go for 2026"?
Yeah, if they're meaningless games, I doubt it. But
Okay.
if there's even a chance, because like last year we were 1 game away from making the playoffs. So if Browning can do what he has historically done and be about a 500 quarterback, which I think is possible, I think the losses are going to stack up while we're playing these incredible defenses for the first couple of weeks of his tenure, and then some wins should likely start to accumulate as he gets more comfort and the defenses aren't quite as daunting as they were last week and this week with the Broncos, and next week I think we have the Lions. So I think if we can stay afloat, he comes back, and I still have some faith that we'll be able to stay afloat, but I know I'm in a shrinking minority in terms of that perspective.
Well, I just need Browning to do well because I have him in a 2-start 16-team league, and it's gross. The quarterbacks are thin. So let's get this shit back on track here, and let's talk some linebackers. Scott, who's a linebacker that you are fired up for in week 4?
Yeah, it's hard to say I'm fired up for this guy because I don't know that he's the most talented player in the NFL, but he's someone who always seems to be a contributor. And now, due to injury and opportunity, I think Tremaine Edmunds is a really good linebacker play as your linebacker 1 or linebacker 2. I was again looking at Sleeper and how frequently he's being started. He's only being started in 7% of Sleeper leagues. And that number is really going to come into context a little bit later when we talk about the linebacker that I'm not as excited about this week. But 7% is a pretty small number. The other thing that I take a look at when it comes to linebackers is, we have some great gurus here at the IDP show when it comes to specific positions and some of the other great things that we do. And when I look at Mike Wollert's projections, especially for linebackers, those are as close to gospel as you can get for me. And he has Edmunds as linebacker 24, which I think is maybe a little bit low. I think I'm a little bit more optimistic for him. I'm not a linebacker modeler by any stretch of the imagination, but when I put in some key metrics like fantasy points allowed, snap shares, baseline PFF grades, just some things like that. He comes out closer to my linebacker 13 this week. So I'm higher on him than Mike, which makes me nervous, higher on him than the field, which makes me okay. But whenever I take a look, again, to be just coming into it with eyes wide open, Noah Sewell was wearing the green dot last week, and that might be cause for concern for some, but Edmunds still played 100% of snaps last week, even though he wasn't wearing the dot. So, Edmunds has been the reliable producer. He had his best game of the season last week, even though he wasn't, as he had that, freedom to move around a little bit, as Mike mentioned in the article where he writes up, all of the linebacker rooms for you to digest. But Edmunds is someone who I picked up a lot in the offseason when I wasn't able to get TJ Edwards because he was too expensive. I know Edmunds had a down year last year. I know his PFF grades are probably never going to be league leading. They're also not like Zach Cunningham circa 2020 terrible. So he's not at risk of losing his job. And he has been producing. He has 34 points last week, which is, not sustainable. But if you look at weeks 1 and week 2, he was over 10 points in each of those weeks. So not only does he have that kind of ceiling that we saw firsthand last week, but his floor is still 10 points a week. And if I can get 10 points a week out of my linebacker 2, which is, again, Mike has him at the end of his linebacker 2s. I have him at the top of my linebacker 2s. I feel like that's a pretty good spot to be in. And the Bears matchup this week is also the most friendly to linebackers that he has had all season in terms of just points allowed to opposing linebackers. So I think there's a lot of room for optimism for Tremaine Edmunds. I don't think he's going to finish as the linebacker 1 for the week. I don't think he's going to have the 34 big 3 points that he had last week, but I think he should be started in more than 7% of sleeper leagues. And like I said, personally, I have him ahead of a whole lot of linebackers who a lot of folks are starting ahead of him.
And I think the green dot, is this thing that we chase just because we know it's going to be tied to volume. And they don't necessarily have to have the green dot to get 100% of snaps. So we have a player like Edmunds who is playing 100% of snaps. He just doesn't have a green sticker on his helmet, which is fine because we chase that green sticker just because it leads to volume. And if we have 2 linebackers who are getting 100% of snaps, we're going to roll them out all the time. And as long as Edwards is sidelined, I think Edmunds makes a great start. I think Sewell makes a great start going forward. And like you said, we've got the volume and a great matchup. I'm with you on this one. So I like it.
Yeah.
One of the players I really liked coming into the season, especially as training camp news kind of ramped up and stuff like that, was Sweet Dee Winters. Winters continues to come early and often this season for the managers who were watching the show during the training camps and reaping the rewards right now with Winters on their roster. Winters has played all but 2 snaps this season for the 49ers defense, and he's been a tackle machine. He's got 20 solo tackles, 1 assist on the season. He has literally 7 or more combined tackles in each of his first 3 games. I love that solid, consistent production from a linebacker in my starting lineup, as it kind of helps me attack the rest of my starters. Looking at my matchup in the week, do I need to hit a home run? I might be swinging for some upside plays, or do I just need some safe other tackle players? Having a player like Dee Winters in my lineup kind of allows me to do that. Looking at his PFF metrics, he's got a 73.4 or higher in each of his first 3 games. The coaching staff loves him. Fred Warner has spoken highly of him. So he's just doing all the right things. He's having all the right things said about him. He's currently the 11th ranked linebacker, according to PFF, with linebackers who have played 20 or more % of the snaps this season. Sadly, we saw Nick Bosa go down earlier last week with an ACL injury, but this might give Winters a few more tackle opportunities, as a few more plays might make it to that second level of the defense. So if you're starting Winters as your linebacker 3, you are thriving from an IDP perspective. And even if you have him as a linebacker 2 on your team, I don't mind him even in a tough start this week against the Jags, who aren't one of the better matchups for linebackers. But I think volume and I think recent production, and I just think his role on the team kind of insulates him from being anything less than that.
Mm-hmm. And I mentioned that Edmunds was my linebacker 13 this week. Winters is my linebacker 12. So I have him as a back end LB1. He's getting the volume. He's grading out well. Like you said, it's a bad matchup, but this early in the season, I try not to overread into matchups because, you have to look at who they've faced so far. You have to look at shuffling of offensive line. You have to look at a whole lot of things that start to smooth out as the season goes on. So I agree with you that the biggest thing he has going against him is that Jacksonville has just not been friendly. They've been allowing 20.17 fantasy points per game to opposing linebackers. That's like 10 points per game for a linebacker, which, is good. You'd be happy to get 10 points a game. But this seems to me like one that could end up going a little bit higher for him. And yeah, I've got him as a back end LB1. So if you're playing him as your LB3, I'm very happy for you, and also happy if, like me, you saw all of the Nick Martin hype in the offseason and you ran out to grab Dee Winters everywhere that you could, because Nick Martin might end up being the guy, but I think the hype was a little bit overdone for, I believe, was a third round pick who graded out more like a 5th or 6th round pick before the draft.
Yeah, he was one of those head scratching picks. Like, I didn't have him going as high when all of a sudden his name got called on Friday night of the draft. I was like, did not see that, like, it got my interest, because obviously probably the 49ers scouting room has a little more intel than I do, but it was still kind of one of those, like, I saw other players ranked higher at that part of the draft, and to see his name get called when it did, I was like, oh, okay, well, here we are. So no, I'm with you. And like, it's fun to see a player like Winters who, dug in the dirt, got his stripes and stuff like that. Now he's get a chance to thrive on that defense, who has historically been a really good linebacker defense. They got Robert Saleh back as a defensive coordinator who really puts players in a great position. And so you're looking at all of those things. And, even like in the training camp, we saw kind of like snippets of him starting to stick out. And, for managers who kind of were paying attention, like, they got a discount value on Winters, and who are now like, yes, let's go, because he's definitely a linebacker 2 at worst. And like you said, and have him in your rankings, got him a late linebacker 1 for the price of a mouse click. So, so, all right, let's get to the back end of our defenses here. And who's a defensive back that you're kind of higher on this week than the consensus?
Yeah, this hurts my heart, and I hope that I'm wrong, that this guy might be primed for a big game, but I'm looking at Jaquan McMillan, who's a corner for the Denver Broncos. I understand that corners are higher variability than safeties, and if you look at performance across the season, I want to say 17 of the top 20 DBs are safeties, and so there's inherent risk that comes when playing corners in non-cornerback required league. But just like I mentioned, whenever I look at linebackers, I first look at Mike. When I look at corners, I look at Johnny the Greek's cornerback corner. And I was reassured after I made this pick to see that he was at least listed as a solid deeper play in the cornerback corner article. He is only being started in 2% of sleeper leagues. So he is, I didn't think to look up his rostership, but I can't imagine he's very heavily rostered either. The reason that I'm so high on him is a little bit to do with him and a lot to do with his matchup. He's playing my beloved Bengals on Monday Night Football. Jake Browning thus far has been a turnover machine. Some of it his fault, some of it not his fault. Like the one Isaiah Rodgers was a great tip pass by Harrison Smith. I still don't know how he was able to get a finger on that ball. But still, the turnovers keep happening. And so there's interception potential. There's potential for another blowout, which would make the Bengals have to pass all the time, which would also be something that you would target for a corner. But the other thing that I like about the matchup that I hate about my Bengals is they're not protecting any quarterback right now. And if you look at PFF grades, he is the best pass rushing corner in the NFL through 3 weeks. So McMillan has a 91.2 PFF pass rush grade. Second place is Parrish in Tampa Bay at 77.8. So he is head and shoulders above the rest of the corners in terms of that nickel corner blitzing the quarterback. The Bengals quarterbacks, whether it was Burrow before he got hurt or Browning more recently, are being constantly harassed as we try to figure out exactly what we're doing on the offensive line and where the holes are and how we can fix them. So I think he has pick potential. He has sack potential. He played a season high 70% of snaps last week as the Broncos looked better than they had the first couple of weeks of the season. So I think Jaquan McMillan has definitely multiple opportunities, multiple paths to having a big game. So especially if you're in a league where you may be dealing with some injuries, maybe you have Bosa and Cashman as like the core of your defense, and you need some big upside swings, then I would really be looking at someone like a Jaquan McMillan to consider in your DB slot or your cornerback required slot. Because again, there are higher floor corners. Johnny mentions a lot of ideal plays and a lot of solid plays for regular leagues, and this was a solid deeper league play. But even at only 70% of snaps, being that slot corner, having that phenomenal pass rush grade, and a matchup against a turnover-prone offense that can't seem to get it together just yet, I think Jaquan McMillan can be an underrated play this week.
Yeah, and when you were chatting there, he's rostered in 16% of leagues right now on Sleeper, which seems pretty low for a player, like you said, with a lot of upside. He's got a great matchup, and what a luxury the defensive Broncos have, because they have studs at every level of that defense. Like, you know, on any given week, it could be anyone. I'm a little surprised that Surtain has gotten picked on as much as he has. You know, being the NFL reigning MVP, defensive MVP from last season, he just kind of like, he got kind of blown up the last couple of weeks. And so like, maybe, you know, if he gets it back, you know, he shuts it down, then all of a sudden things start to go the other way with him. So, yeah, Denver's defense was one of those highly rated team defenses heading into the season. And I think maybe even they were a little overinflated themselves. So I like the call there. So I'm going to go to a slot corner who I was really high on last season, who kind of let me down in week 1, but I think he's kind of back, and that's Quentin Lake. And so after a rough start to the season, I think it's Lake's time is officially back. He's in my circle of trust once again. Lake has played every single snap for the defense of the Rams, a total of 196 snaps. But it's not only that he has played 196 snaps, but it's where he's getting those snaps, where he's lining up at. I'm really excited for Lake in week 4. Of those 196 snaps, he has 183 of them in that IDP sweet spot that we talk about a lot. And that's that along the defensive line, in the box, or in the slot position. 93%. That is an outstanding. That's higher than a lot of linebackers get for box snaps. And so after a rough week 1, like I mentioned, he rebounded really well in week 2 and week 3. He's got 12 solos. He's had 2 assisted tackles. He even had 4 pass breakups last week. So really starting to come along, not only in those tackle heavy leagues, but those big plays are coming. He had 5 pressures as well. And so, or 4 QB pressures, excuse me. So, you know, between the sacks, the possible interceptions, just like you mentioned with McMillan, like they're a real possibility. And I know that not all defensive snaps are created equal, and we'll kind of get to that as we start to talk about some of these fade people. But man, if I can get a defensive back who's basically playing as a in the box linebacker for 93% of the snaps, I don't think you could do any worse. And right now, Lake, you know, maybe after that slow start, he's kind of slept on a little bit. I see him kind of as in that late DB2 range, maybe slip into the DB3 range. So I think that he's back. He's going to keep continuing to ascend to where he was last season. And he was a great waiver wire claim last year.
Yeah. And again, full disclosure, not a DB ranker, just looking at some metrics, modeling some stuff to see how I can do behind the scenes. So I've got Lake as a back end DB1 this week. I think that he really does have that potential. Like you said, he's playing in the right spots. He's playing 100% of snaps, putting up great PFF grades. The Colts are the 11th best matchup against safeties through 3 weeks. So whether you consider him a safety, because there's a safety some places and that delineate between the two, but you know, favorable matchup. I don't see the Colts magic lasting forever, and he is someone that could be a prime beneficiary if it does start to run out here sooner rather than later. So I know we talked a lot about Quentin Lake last season on the start sit shows because we were constantly getting questions about him, and you were constantly going Lake. And eventually I started co-signing. Well, I'm back on board. I picked him up in some places in the off season, and I would have every confidence in the world starting him this week.
You are going to be an every week regular here, Scott, because you have been like pumping me up on the last couple calls. So you are making me feel really good about my shout outs here this week. So
hey, we didn't share notes, so that could come.
No, we did not.
Down
That
here
was
very quickly when we get into
here,
the next group of players. I might be like, well, that he's actually a back end LB1 for me too. So we'll have to see who you're lower on.
You're fired. You're fired. You're Scott. You're fired.
just cut the second half of the show and keep the first if that ends up being the case.
And that'll do it for this week. Thanks for joining us. So, you had kind of mentioned like when you were looking at your roster construction and how important that 100% of snaps is. We're 3 weeks into the season. We have a little bit of data to go on. Thinking about doing your lineups and leagues and things like that. Scott, are you at this point like I'm trusting the volume? I'm trusting the snap alignment right now to make my decisions, maybe over like what the box score might say, or are you kind of trusting box score numbers, or are you trusting the behind the metrics piece?
No, I am always very slow to trust box score numbers. I'm always much more prone to trust snap shares and alignment when they're paired with good underlying metrics. So a lot of the players who I talk about in the weekly DL streaming articles are players who have put up 6 to 10 pressures and no sacks yet, but have a pass rush grade that's in the top quartile for their position. Those are the guys that I'm still riding with because I know that things are going to bear out and they're likely to continue getting those high snap shares versus someone, not to preview too much here, who may have done a lot on a little and underlying metrics aren't as good and snap shares seem to become a little bit less solid. So I try not to chase box scores at any point, really. And sometimes that's made me late on people. Like I hope he recovers well, but I have never been in on Kalijah Cansey, even as he put up great box score numbers, because his underlying metrics were generally terrible. And I was waiting for the floor to drop out. I didn't expect him to get injured, and I hope he ends up being okay. But he's one of those guys who, I was wrong on because I was so focused on those other metrics, but I also wasn't changing. I was on preview shows this season saying, hey, no, I wasn't touching him. And I think he put up a donut in his first game when he was fully healthy, and it was a slow start, but I'm always going to be a snap share and alignment and advanced metrics when they're supported by underlying data points more so than chasing the current league leader in sacks or tackles or interceptions or whatever it might be through just a couple of weeks or even halfway through the season or whatever it might be, because we know that circumstances change and it makes players more or less attractive.
How many times a day do you use the word quartile in conversation?
This was first today.
Okay.
Granted, I was doing a lot of writing today and not much talking, but I don't think I typed the word quartile today either.
That really just flowed right into the conversation. I'm like, wow, that is just dropping some knowledge. So that was a word of the day. So before we flip the script here and go to some players that we're going to be fading, we got a quick review here. We got Chris Jones and Dorance Armstrong as our defensive lines we like more this week. Tremaine Edmunds and Sweet Dee Winters. We got Jaquan McMillan and Quentin Lake. Now we're going to flip the script here and go to some defensive linemen who we're not really big fans of. And this first one, Scott, I'm going to be honest with you. I had him on the show as a player to start last week, and he kind of disappointed. So interested to see where is he going and why.
Carl Granderson is someone who I've been high on at various points in the season. I wasn't last week, and I got lucky in that I wasn't last week, but he was featured heavily in week 1 and week 2 of my streaming articles because he was very under rostered. I think last week he wasn't included more so because he became too rostered to even be eligible for me to talk about him as a streamer. So I'm not going to try to seem too much like Nostradamus here, but he just completely crash landed back to earth last week. We saw his snap share drop to 60%, and that's defensive tackle range. A lot of defensive tackles get a better snap share than that. He put up 0 pressures last week. If you look at his incredibly hot start to the season, he was converting 2/3 of his pressures into sacks, which is something that is not sustainable. He had 4 sacks on 6 pressures. You're not going to keep that up throughout the season. So last week we saw 0 sacks on 0 pressures. When I look to see how much I expect that regression to the mean to actually take effect, I like to look at some of, like I said, the underlying grading metrics, and I love PFF for that. If you look at Granderson's PFF pass rush grade, it's a 54.7. So it's not like he has been posting these phenomenal pass rush grades and converting an unexpectedly high number of pressures into sacks. He's been converting an unexpectedly high number of pressures into sacks while not generating too many pressures and not grading out very well and seeing a declining snap share. And if that wasn't enough to get you off of Carl Granderson, he has a horrible matchup this week against the Buffalo Bills. The Buffalo Bills have allowed exactly one 10-point fantasy performance to an opposing defensive end through 3 weeks. So there have been plenty of guys. All it would take is 1 sack and you're at 10 points. They're not doing it. They're allowing on average 15 points per game to the position. So across all of the defensive ends that rotate on an NFL team, you add up all of those points, and the combined edge rooms for the first 3 opponents are barely a viable edge performance for a single week. So it's red flag after red flag after red flag. And while there may be a time when he gets dropped enough and the metrics start to look better and the matchup starts to look better, where I'll be back on board with Carl Granderson, the fact that he is being started in 27% of leagues on Sleeper as of today, again, compared to 3% for Chris Jones, just makes no sense to me whatsoever.
I think this is a case of recency bias. And so it's one of those things like, you know, we talk about box score chasers, and you have in your leagues, you know exactly who they are. You know, they're the player that picked up Isaiah Rodgers this week because he had a big game. They're going to plug him in the lineup, and then they're going to be really disappointed when he's got like a 6-point game next week. You know, so we see this all the time. Granderson, a phenomenal start to the season. One of those really underrated players throughout his career. It was fun to see him get this hot start, but like you said, unsustainable. That's not a very sticky stat to be able to kind of keep that coming back again a week in and week out. And so that regression, it happens. So like that call, unfortunately for the Saints fans and for fantasy managers who have Granderson. Mm-hmm. My player that I'm kind of fading this week, and this is a player that a few years ago was maybe one of the most talked about players in the defensive line position, got moved to a new team. We had a whole fiasco with all of that stuff, and then moved to another team this offseason, and that's Haason Reddick. For him, my panic meter is starting to kind of increase here as we're heading into week 4. When we look at Reddick, who is a player that played 156 snaps so far this season, that's 80% for the team, which is great. When we look at those, he only has 12 QB pressures, and he's turned those into 11 hurries, but only 1 sack, and that came in week 1. I know that sacks are tough to come by in the NFL, but Reddick is just a few seasons from a super high finish from those finishing those plays, and he just hasn't been that guy this season, and he clearly was not that guy last season for Philly as he took most of the season off. Could those come? Absolutely, they could, but not only is Reddick not getting the sacks, he's not getting any tackle numbers either. He only has 4 solos and 4 assists on the season, and most of those came in 1 game. And so if you're in a league that uses big 3 scoring, Reddick has 2 weeks of less than 5 fantasy points per contest. And if you're starting 1 or 2, there's a lot better, more consistent options on the waiver wires than you can do with Reddick. Now, if you're starting a league with 3 or 4, maybe you're okay waiting for those bigger spike weeks, which they're probably going to come. And now that I mentioned him on this week, he's probably going to have a big spike week this week because he does get a really nice matchup versus the Eagles. But if he doesn't get it done this week, there really is the panic meter really rising for me with Reddick this season. So
here is the first place we're going to disagree because
perfect. Love it.
I have Reddick as a high-end DL2 this week.
Okay.
A lot of it, and I it's not that I disagree with any of the things that you were saying. You know, the Eagles are a plus matchup, but Reddick has not been converting sacks into or pressures into sacks as we'd expect. But he has at least solid underlying pass rush grade at 63.5. So I have a feeling those numbers are going to start to come. And the other thing that has me a little bit higher on him is he's still playing 80% of snaps. I mean, he is out there on the field an awful lot. And if I haven't seen an update on Mike Evans, but if Evans isn't playing and if Godwin isn't playing, then I think that Buccaneers offense might not be as good. And so game scripts might be a little bit different. And there just could be different opportunities. I know his tackle numbers haven't been great, but he has at least been in position to make tackles with a run defense grade of 75.5, which is pretty high for a defensive end. Again, in my modeling, run defense is a fraction of the weight of pass rush for edges because, you know, we know how much more important that is and those sacks are from a statistical perspective. But I think he's someone who could have a good game if the Eagles end up running a lot or if they end up passing a lot. And, you know, he's still very under rostered, which is why he's featured in the article again this week. He burned me a little bit last week with a very run-of-the-mill performance, but I think that week, last week, where I think maybe he had 6 or 8 fantasy points, something like that, is more of a representing his floor. And if I know that's what I'm going to get, and he converts one of those 11 pressures into a sack, just from being a volume play, you know, I get it's not great to have 11 on that many snaps, but he's out there getting the snaps, and I'm attracted to that. So we'll see. We'll see who's right about this one. When you said that he's going to have a great game because you're bringing him up, I hope so, because that will help my my article metrics. But I do have him. You know, he is probably the most unexpected name in that group because he's just below like the Hunters and the Crosbys and the Parsons, Burns, Joey Bosa. I guess that one's unexpected too, but you know, I think he has some nice back end or high end DL2 kind of upside.
Who would have thought at this point in the season, Joey Bosa is the healthiest of the Bosa brothers? So,
yeah, no, I've got 4 in a row. I've got Joey Bosa, Haason Reddick, Nick Herbig, and Tui Tuipulotu, 4 guys that I would not have expected to have as high end DL2s in week 4. I mean, I've always liked Tooley, but you know, I didn't think the ceiling was quite that high, and we'll see if he lives up to it.
Here we are. Be ready for everything, right? This has been a season like, you know, unlike others. So, you know, and this is what I appreciate, Scott, when you come on the show, you don't just like, you know, the bobblehead and agree. Like, we don't have to, like, I love the discourse here and being able to go back and forth because, you know, you've already mentioned Mike doing the shout outs with the linebacker stuff and Johnny with the cornerback stuff. You have to get your props too with all of the work that you do for the show, with all of the defensive line and the streaming article that comes out. I am guilty of using that on numerous occasions across multiple teams. So I appreciate the work that you do with that. And, you know, like, as much as we love Mike for doing the linebacker stuff and we love Johnny for selling his soul to the devil to do all of the defensive back stuff, you deserve just as much praise and props as those two do, because, you know, the defensive line, it's a tough market, you know, and for you to dig in the metrics like you do and have the success that you do with the names and things like that. So, you know, kudos.
Hey, I appreciate that. I was waiting for a but. I thought that was just like a really long preamble before a but. You couldn't be more wrong on Reddick. I'm sticking. So thank you. No, I enjoy doing it. Like I said, Johnny inspired me whenever I had my own little site that I set up to start doing streaming just for defensive tackles. And then I realized that you could expand it out to defensive linemen. I'm excited for the guys for giving me a platform and hopefully you've picked some winners from those 20 or so names that I put out every week.
Well, I'll let you know on Sunday how we did with the Tampa Bay, or actually, Monday night, right? Did they play on
Yeah.
Monday or no?
No.
Okay, yeah.
Monday night's the Bengals Broncos, which I've never been less.
Oh, and then the other
looking
game
forward
got
to
flexed to
football.
Comedy Central, right? The Dolphins and Jets game. Actually, that got flexed to Comedy Central, so that's a totally different game. So, yeah, we get 2 Monday night games, and we have our first international game this week. So we got
That's right. Yeah.
football. We got a big day of football on Sunday, and it stretches into Monday. So, another Tampa Bay player is making the list here as a linebacker to fade. Scott, tell us more.
Okay, so this is another one that hurts just because how much I love this guy. I've got him all over in D up. He's been a stalwart for us for a very long time, but this week in particular, I am not as high on Lavonte David as most are. The market seems to have cooled down on him a little bit. He is only being started currently in 13% of sleeper IDP leagues. So that is way down from where it's been historically. Again, looking at Mike's linebacker projections, Mike has him as a high-end LB2. So I'm only one tier below. I have him closer to a mid-tier LB3 this week. And the reasons are I kind of want to see what this season's going to look like for him, because thus far it has not been overly impressive. His PFF grade is slipping compared to past years. He's the 42nd graded linebacker through 3 weeks. His grade is a full 12 points below what it ended at last year. Now, I'm not saying that he's off the cliff. I'm not saying that he's not going to end up having another phenomenal season, or that he might even have more to come from a dynasty perspective. What I am saying is I am more willing to trust some of the hotter hands that have solid underlying metrics than I am Lavonte David at this point. So he is currently LB15. So he is producing from a fantasy perspective. But if you look where that production is coming from, he has 2 sacks already. And he's always been a good linebacker at getting sacks. So it's not an anomaly that he could do that. But he's also not going to keep up this pace and end up with, most likely, not going to keep up this pace and end up with double-digit sacks at the end of the year. So when I look at those 2 sacks through 3 games, and I want to see what his tackle floor is, he actually ranks 38th in tackles among linebackers. So not there like it used to be. Too big play dependent for me to be relying on him right now. Again, as much as it pains me to say that, because I love him in best ball. I have him in some of my managed leagues as well, where I'm starting to figure out, all right, am I going to start him, or am I going to start a Dee Winters? And honestly, I'd probably go with Dee Winters this week over Lavonte David. And I just think that the floor is better, and I look for more floor in my linebackers than upside, unless I'm in a league where, I'm starting 3 linebackers, then I'll do like 2 floor, and then a David or a Caden Ellis or someone else, Frankie Louvu, if he gets it back together. But the last thing that has me fading David a little bit more than most this week is, like I mentioned, LB15 on the strength of 2 sacks. The Eagles have allowed a total of 0 sacks to linebackers so far this season. So 0 sacks to linebackers, and also 0 10-point performances by linebackers, which is pretty crazy when you think about how, I wouldn't say easy it is to get 10 points as a linebacker, and especially how heavily the Eagles were running the ball for the first 2 weeks. I know they started passing more last week and got A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith involved, and Goddard was back and played well as well. But no 10-point performances to opposing linebackers yet. No sacks whatsoever to opposing linebackers yet. I just don't know that this is David's week.
No, and I'm with you for all the same reasons. And I think, as sad as it is, like, we have to sometimes take the name away and look at like the numbers and the metrics and things like that. And like being a linebacker purist, like Bobby Wagner's always in my lineup. Lavonte David was, in lineup, but sometimes, like Father Time's undefeated for a reason. And so sometimes we maybe have to turn the page on some of these players. Not that you're going to be able to get out from like any ownership or rostership of Lavonte David at this point, but maybe this might be the time if you can flip, for a Dee Winters or maybe you get somebody like that. It'll just be like, oh, Lavonte David, so. Speaking of aging linebackers and kind of having a poor start, this one is painful because not only do I have Zaire Franklin on many rosters, I picked him as being the linebacker 1 in our linebacker prediction at the beginning of the season. And like many, they predicted to be a linebacker 1 this season, not a linebacker 1, the linebacker 1 at the start of the season. So he started to make me nervous for his chances. Franklin is coming off the ankle injury, as we know. It's kept him out of the preseason. So basically these first few weeks of the regular season have kind of served as Franklin's preseason as he's kind of gotten ramped up, and his stats really aren't meeting expectations, nor is the investment that many fantasy managers put into Franklin that we're getting these results right now. Is there a chance for him to return to form? Absolutely there is. But I think those weeks are maybe a few weeks out yet as he gets kind of gets back into NFL game shape. Not only that, but the scheme change for him going from a zone friendly scheme last year to this new man heavy scheme under new defensive coordinator Lou Anarumo, it may have taken more of a toll on Franklin than we were projecting it to be. Franklin has played 166 snaps this season. He has 13 tackles, 6 assists, no sacks, no interceptions. His PFF scores are the lowest of his career right now. Could those be the lingering effects of his ankle? Yes, but entering age 29 at the start of the season, like we just mentioned with Lavonte David, Father Time's undefeated for a reason. And we could be near, at, or even over the cliff right now on Franklin. So if I'm a manager with Franklin on my roster, and if I'm nervous, like I am, kind of looking at, I'm maybe trying to see if I can move him for a younger piece while he still has that name recognition value. Maybe, he still carries that LB1 vibe. And if I can move off of him and maybe get a player like Dee Winters plus for him, I'm absolutely crushing that deal right now. To be fair, we have seen Franklin increase in snaps every week since week 1. His tackle numbers have increased each week since week 1. But maybe that's just me being optimistic or at least drinking the hopium at this point. But I really don't like using the word if in my lineups if I can avoid it. So Scott, are you with me with your level of concern with Franklin, or am I kind of on an island here on Love Island with Franklin?
I'm with you. When you mentioned his PFF grades are down, you're underselling it. So
I was being generous. Yes.
Among linebackers who have played at least 50% of snaps this season, he is the 59th out of 61 players. His overall
Who are the two below him? Who are the two below him?
35.7. Servassier Dennis is at 60, and Payton Wilson is at 61.
And Dennis was a player we called out last week as a player to fade because there was a lot of speculation about his role in the defense.
So I think there are definitely alarm bells for Franklin. I mentioned I did some quick modeling, back of napkin modeling, and I had him as an LB3 this week. Does that mean I would have the guts to start 30 some other linebackers over Zaire Franklin? Probably not. He's someone who has built up enough of a reputation where I would really squint at those metrics and look for if I do a 0.25 adjustment here, then that gets him up to a back end LB2, and I think that feels a little bit less crazy. But still, a back end LB2 is not what we drafted him to be. So he's someone else. Don't cut him unless you're going to start one IDP league, in which case, move on, because you should be streaming every single week your best possible players. But I want to see what he does when he's fully healthy. I want to see if these grades are going to improve, if it is Anarumo's defense, if it is the injury, just what exactly is going on before I start him with the confidence that, you should have when you invest the kind of draft capital that you had to invest to get Zaire Franklin.
And thinking about, he's got very little for competition right now. I mean, Joe Bacci has been the LB2 there. Jalen Carlisa seems like he's a week or two away, maybe from returning from his shoulder injury. Haven't really heard anything about that situation. So it's not like he's like losing snaps or tackle opportunities to, a partner there. And we've seen historically that the Indianapolis Colts linebackers have thrived. Last year, EJ Speed and Franklin both were top LB1 options last season. Franklin obviously with the one spot, but Speed was, I think, 5 or 6 at the end of the season. So this it's sustainable for them to both thrive. And we don't even have one thriving linebacker right now on this defense. So
yeah, and you mentioned the scheme change with Anarumo, but it's not like that scheme has been unfriendly to linebackers in the past. If you look at Cincinnati last year, Jermaine Pratt was an LB1 and Logan Wilson was an LB2. So, it was churning out some really, really nice underlying fantasy production for both linebackers. The fact that they can't even get one to be a producer yet, it makes me, it could be lose defense, but he's produced plenty of well-performing, even before Pratt had his breakout fantasy year. Logan Wilson was still a really viable, linebacker 2, at least for most leagues in most of Anarumo's tenure at Cincinnati. So yeah, I think the alarm bells are starting to ring, and man, that 35.7. It's you mentioned it's autumn and the leaves are turning, and that's a really dark leaf if you look at the PFF chart.
That's a red maple leaf right there. That's a John Macri Canadian leaf right there, red. So all right. So after dissing me with Haason Reddick, but agreeing with me on Franklin, you're kind of back on the Christmas card list right now. So let's keep it going. Let's see how we finish up here. We got our defensive backs to fade. And this one, you're going to have to do some convincing, because this has been a player that historically has been a cornerstone for many, many IDP teams.
Yeah, I was going to say, you might take me off the Christmas card list as a result of this one. But it's Budda Baker. So I like Budda Baker a lot long-term. I like him for Dynasty. I like him for the rest of the season. It is this particular week, I am a little bit lower than the rest. He has started in 52% of sleeper leagues. So again, contrast that with Jaquan McMillan, who is being started in 2% of leagues. And there's a pretty that tells you just how many names are between Budda Baker and the rest of the field in terms of who people are starting. If you look at his production so far this year, he is DB 31, safety 27 on the season. So the production hasn't been there. I tried to figure out why the production hasn't been there. So I looked at his utilization split in terms of box snaps, slot snaps, and free safety snaps. He's playing all 3 positions, but you know what? He played all 3 last year in pretty similar proportions to what he's doing this year. So it's not like he's suddenly doing something different. The one thing that I did notice is that his overall quality of play per PFF has dipped significantly. He was a 77.8 in terms of his overall PFF grade last year. Through 3 weeks, he's a 61 this year. So that's a 16.8 point drop. So, those aren't the be all end all. You can have really bad players and teams pick on those bad players. And so you get more tackles. And, I'm not trying to make it seem like, we should only be starting the best players and, fading all the worst, especially when it comes to defensive backs. But that significant of a dip through 3 weeks is a little bit concerning. I think he is going to rebound. I just don't think it's going to be this week. He plays in Thursday Night Football against the Seattle Seahawks. The Seahawks are the 4th toughest match up in the league against opposing safeties. They're averaging 16.42 points to safeties overall. Again, you got 2 safeties usually that are out there for you're the Vikings. You got 3 safeties, and some teams rotate. 16.42 points to entire safety room so far. Last week, they allowed a combined 13 points to opposing safeties. So the Seahawks have just been a brutal matchup for opposing safeties. Baker is the best safety Seattle has seen all season. So, we talked about how I don't want to read too much into that, but it's a tough matchup. He hasn't produced yet, and the underlying metrics aren't great. So even though I like Baker, I would probably consider him like a back end safety 2, high end safety 3 this week, but he's still being played as if he's a safety 1 lock and load. And I get that too. He's one of, I think, only 5 DBs that was being drafted in most D-up drafts. Those incredibly shallow 60-player drafts. People had to invest a lot of capital to be able to get Budda Baker, and once you get him, you're going to play him. But I don't know, play at your own peril. And it hasn't really worked out for you through 3 weeks. I don't know that this is going to be the week that does it. I just think there are better options out there for this particular week. And I think he's a great buy low candidate. If you're in Dynasty or if you're in an active trading redraft league, then go out and get Budda Baker because he's going to hit eventually. It's just harder for me to see that path this week.
And I think that's a great segue too, because these aren't players that we're like not playing or we're cutting. We're just kind of tempering expectations a little bit because, you know, like you mentioned with Zaire Franklin, do you have the stones really to not put Zaire Franklin in your starting lineup? Probably not. You know, I think if you do, you're probably playing it too cute.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of the same thing with Budda Baker. You know, Budda Baker has this huge history of being a top performer. You know, he is entering age 29. He's the last 3 weeks, he's gotten fewer and fewer tackles. You know, he had like 10 tackles. I think it was in week 3, 8 tackles in like week 2, and then only like 6 last week. So, you know, if that trend continues, he's got a poor matchup. The trend is that he's trending in the wrong direction for getting tackles. Like playing a Thursday night game, a short week, this might be a great opportunity. Like if you're a betting individual, you know, maybe you look at the Budda Baker tackle box props and see, hey, if he's at like 8.5 or 6.5 or whatever it is, take the under maybe. So,
yeah, I mean, he had 10 in week 1, 8 in week 2, 6 in week 3. And, you know, it's 3 tackles, 3 assists in week 3. Yeah, it's a 6-point performance. And we tend to want more than that. And just given how deep the safety field is, you know, I've got a lot of players whose names I didn't really know before the season started that are pretty viable plays this week as well. So, you know, he's a good player. He is someone who I would start in a lot of circumstances, but again, temper expectations. Don't get too cute, but when you have someone like Quentin Lake, who I see as like a back end DB1 versus Baker, who this week I see as more like a DB3, then you give it a really hard look and you probably tinker a good bit between now and kickoff. But luckily it's a Thursday kickoff. So you're either going to be celebrating on Friday morning or breathing a sigh of relief for not playing him on Friday morning. But either way, you won't be in suspense for too long.
And just looking up on Underdog right now, we've got his line is at 7.5 tackles or assist, and you can bump it to 9.5 and still take the under if you're interested in doing that. So that's a different show. That's a different show. But by the time that show airs, it's going to be way past Thursday night. So that one might be past you. So
yeah.
All right. Last player that we're going to fade this week. This is a really easy one for me. Reed Blankenship. Super easy fade, and not only in this week, but probably for the rest of the season. We talked earlier about not all defensive snaps are created equal. You know, Quentin Lake is playing all of his snaps near the line of scrimmage, playing 100% of the snaps for his defense. Reed Blankenship also playing 100% of snaps for his defense. But it's where that opportunity for Blankenship is coming at, with Lake playing 97% of his snaps near the line of scrimmage. Blankenship is almost like the opposite side of that coin here. Blankenship, 100% of snaps, like we mentioned, but he has played 157 of his 187 snaps as a deep safety. And so playing that far away from the line of scrimmage has given him fewer plays and opportunities on defense. And it's evident as he only has 6 tackles and 1 assist on the entire season. Not one game, the entire season. He has 0 QB pressures. He has 0 sacks, 0 interceptions, even 0 pass breakups. So preseason, both Lake and Blankenship were pretty close in ADP. And so if you are savvy fantasy managers, which if you listen to Scott, if you listen to Johnny, if you listen to Mike, you know, probably were in tune, you were easily taking Lake in that situation just because of where he was getting or projected to get his snaps from. And so it's pretty clear that if you went with Lake, that's a safe and smart option. I don't know if Blankenship is even rosterable at this point in the season just because of how far away he's like playing like deep center field. Like it's gross. And he's got a ton of talent in front of him. There's not a lot of plays that get to that third level of the defense for the Eagles. So Are you back in the circle of trust here, Scott, or are you going to tell me that Blankenship is a DB1?
Yeah, no, he is not a DB1. I have him about 30 spots behind Budda Baker. So even though I'm low on Budda Baker, I am incredibly low on Reed Blankenship. And the way I model, I don't tend to penalize players for bad grades. I just don't give them bonuses for having really good grades. If I did penalize for bad grades, Blankenship would be even lower. So of the 123 safeties that have played, well, let me cut that a little bit better. So if we just look at safeties that have played at least half of the snaps this season, which is a pretty low threshold for safeties, there have been 67 of them. Reed Blankenship is 66th in terms of his PFF grade. He is sitting at a 33. Only Isaiah Polamau at a 29.9 PFF grade has played worse per PFF. And again, they like Blankenship. I don't see them benching him anytime soon, but that's rough. And that does not instill confidence in me to want to play him in fantasy, because those are the kind of numbers where if you keep putting them up, something has got to give.
And maybe we start to see Sidney Brown take more of a role, maybe playing a little bit more. Full disclosure, Isaiah Polamau was almost my call this week as a defensive back to fade, but at least he's getting stats. At least he's racking up tackles and things like that. He's producing, where Blankenship just isn't getting.
Yeah, and that's a great full circle moment, because like we were saying, you can be a bad performer, but you can be putting up stats. And so, there could be some virtue to that. At least in the short term. It's when you're a bad performer and you're not putting up stats, then like, what are we doing still playing this guy?
Right.
Like there's not a clear path there, minus a random splash play, pick 6 interception that makes him look great suddenly. But even then, that might, bump his grade to a 40 for the season. We'd have to see.
Yeah, for the 6 or 7 weeks you had him in your lineup, you took him out. That would be the week that he would spike and hit. So All right, before we get to the players, we have us scratching our heads this week. Just a quick recap of the fades. At defensive linemen, we have Carl Granderson and Haason Reddick, which Scott and I are kind of disagreeing on, but we'll see how that goes next week. Linebackers are Lavonte David and Zaire Franklin, and then Budda Baker and Reed Blankenship. So to wrap up the show, Scott, who is a player that you are kind of like, what is going on with this player? Maybe it's him, maybe it's the team, but who's that guy?
It's Payton Wilson. So a lot of hope about Payton Wilson coming into this year. And there's really 3 big questions that I kept finding myself coming back to. First is he being benched or is he not? Because last week, Cole Holcomb got the start alongside Patrick Queen instead of Payton Wilson. This week, he's listed preliminarily on the starter on the unofficial depth chart for the Steelers. So who knows what the expected role is for him on the team. The second question is he good or is he not? Last year, he graded out for the season at a 74, which was the 17th best among all linebackers who played significant snaps. This season, he grades out as a 32, which is 74th among 74 linebackers. So, or 75 maybe. He's in that bottom 3 that we mentioned earlier. And the third question is whether or not Patrick Queen is as cooked as we thought. I spent a lot of time on IDP drafts this offseason talking about how I want nothing to do with Patrick Queen and how he is primed to lose his job. Last season he had a 56.8 PFF grade, which was 78th by the end of the season of all the players who had significant snaps. This season, he's a 51.9, so his overall play has gotten worse. That's 56. That's still well above where Wilson is, but he's still playing 92 to 100% of snaps. So it's not like there's a good viable option that we thought Payton Wilson was to usurp him. And we thought Patrick Queen was just, we talked about him as a cut candidate at different points of this offseason because of how much the team liked Wilson and didn't seem to like Queen, and how much they overinvested in Queen with the contract they gave him. But I really don't know what to make of Payton Wilson. What I do know is that I am not playing him in the short term. Doesn't mean he won't be a good player in the long run. I think there are a lot of other rookies and second-year players who I still have long-term hope on, but I don't want anything to do with until we understand their role better. He is the most prime example of it, except that his underlying metrics are just bad this year. And it's not like a Chop Robinson who's still doing something, just not getting as many snaps as we expected, or a Demetrius Knight who, we don't know what he's going to be doing from week to week with Oren Burks, and how they're splitting up time there. Wilson, he could go out and have a great week this week. He could produce an absolute stinker. He could put up 80% of snaps. He could put up 30% of snaps. None of these things would be surprising to me. And that's nothing that I want anything to do with in terms of my starting lineup.
Yeah. And there's that word again, that if, that there's such a wide variance in what he could do if, and in week 4, still too early in your season to be riding that gamble train, to be like pushing yourself, like, if this breaks this way, or if this goes this way, it's too early. Let's stick to what we know. Let's stick to the metrics that are like that sticky stat piece again. So interesting that Cole Holcomb and Payton Wilson only have one ACL between the two of them. So that's kind of interesting, So you're still on my Christmas list, but after kind of shunning Payton Wilson, you might not be on Jason King's Christmas list. So I hope you can live with yourself, Scott.
That's okay, because when I mentioned that I was low on Cansey earlier in the year, that was a podcast with me, Jason, and Jace Abbey, and they were kind of giving me strange looks for not being high on Cansey. So I think I was already on rocky ground, but that's okay. He's still a good guy. Still love his stuff.
Yep.
And I think he would agree, though, if you have Wilson on your taxi squad, you're in a really good spot because you didn't commit to bringing him up and burning that if you're in a league that plays with taxi squads. And I'd be curious to see how many shares even Payton Wilson stands like Jason or Josh, I know, took Payton Wilson as his 6th round flyer in a ton of those D-up leagues. It could work out, but at this point in the season, that's not a bet I want to make.
Yeah. Yep. Last player of the night we're going to chat about here is a player that I want to be good so bad, is Jaquan Brisker. I have a number of him across shares and across many leagues. He looks the part. He is like what you want in a box safety. He's playing every snap. We have this history of him performing really, really well. But here we are once again looking at the stats and wondering what is going on. Brisker's an every down player for the Bears. He has 14 tackles, 1 assist on the season. Meh on the production part. But he's a player that was consistently ranked in the top 12 across numerous ranking platforms before the season and on a weekly basis. I know that Brisker's coming back from a really scary concussion last season. He basically had to relearn his balance and relearn his hand-eye coordination, which kudos to him for putting in that time and work to put yourself back on the field again. So I'm not one to sit here and say he shouldn't be playing, but that's pretty scary when you think about having to relearn hand-eye coordination just to play the game again. Getting back to the fantasy piece of this, though, we're always chasing volume, and Brisker checks the box on that. We throw in the fact that the Bears are still down a starting linebacker with TJ Edwards. We thought, okay, here it comes. Here's Brisker's chance to play more in the box, more safety. But Dennis Allen outsmarted us all. Week 1, Brisker played 26 snaps in the sweet spot, 30 deep. In week 2, he played 26 snaps in the sweet spot, 33 deep. And last week, without TJ Edwards, we're like, here it comes. This is the week Brisker is going to fill that role of that pseudo every down linebacker. He played 24 in the box, 50 deep. We've talked ad nauseum tonight, Scott, about how not all snaps are created equal. And I don't know if we can blame Brisker for this, if we blame Dennis Allen for this, but here's a player that, was crushing it earlier in his career. And now we're just not, he just doesn't seem to be getting the opportunity that I want him to get, or, where are we at? So like, curse you, Dennis Allen, curse you and your black heart for doing this to us. So.
Well, for what it's worth, I'm starting Brisker a lot this week, and the usage does concern me. But what excites me is that the Raiders are the best matchup in the league for safeties so far this season, and they have not played a lot of good safeties outside of Derwin James. They gave up a 14.5-point performance to Craig Woodson, New England Patriots safety, a 29.85-point performance to Jalen Hawkins, another New England safety. Granted, they shut down the Commanders safeties last week, but there's not really much to write home about in terms of that safety room, and at least in terms of what we expected. So,
especially with Will Harris going down with a broken fibula.
So I think there's a lot of optimism that this could be. There's at least a lot of optimism with me. I can say I have Brisker in probably 4 of my dynasty leagues that I actively manage in terms of either modified best ball where I have to set an active lineup, or just traditional set a starting lineup. And I'm playing him in 3 out of the 4. The only one I'm not, I have like Derwin James and I'm trying to think of who I have. I have someone else who is also like a locked in safety one. So I get that it's concerning. I think there was a lot of concern coming into the season that, he's 1 injury away from being done, and that cooked his dynasty value, cooked his value in dynasty startup drafts that I was able to see this offseason. And I get that he's confusing in terms of the usage and the production, but I think whereas Wilson is not someone I would bet on to get it turned around this week, I think Brisker is much more in that camp, and it's not just me being a Penn State homer. It is seeing that he's done it before. It's a great matchup. He's getting the snaps, and we talked about Reed Blankenship as a 30-point something. Brisker just had it, and then I lost it. Brisker's a 68.4, so he's playing well overall.
He's twice the player Blankenship is.
he's and the weird thing, I think it's his coverage grade that's pulling him down a little bit, but he's a 77 in run defense and a 78 in pass rush. So when he does get the chance to do a little bit of that fun stuff in his box snaps, he's grading out well. He's doing good at what he's doing. It's just not converting into the stat sheet yet. But again, Raiders are a great matchup. He's getting 100% of the snaps. Who knows? This could be the week where it becomes 50 sweet spot and 30 some deep, or we don't know what to expect. But I trust the talent and I love the matchup. So I feel like I have a little idea of what to do with Jaquan Brisker compared to some others.
So you're predicting 80 offensive snaps for the Raiders this weekend. That's what I just heard you say. So that's what I heard. And this baffles me, and this is like more like philosophical piece. Like, so you and I sit here, we look at PFF metrics, we look at all the data, and we see Brisker a much better in the box, run graded, pass rushing thing. But then why does a defensive coordinator play him deep when he has such a better skill set to be in the box? I guess that's kind of where you picking up what I'm putting down here, Scott? Like,
yeah, I think it's in part what else is in the room. I think it's in part liking to be versatile and move people around, even based on something like a particular formation or personnel group that the other side is putting out on the field. So I think that, defensive coordinators make a lot more in the moment adjustments, and they're still humans. Sometimes they get too cute and they make mistakes, and we've seen lots of players. I mean, look at Zach Bond's usage as an edge rusher for years with some decent defensive coordinators, and then suddenly someone says, you know what, I think you might be a little bit better suited to be an off-ball linebacker, and then he thrives. Look at some players who've made the opposite transition. There have been some great defensive coordinators at Penn State through the years that have gone on to to be head coaches at other programs or have prominent jobs in the NFL, but they've miscast folks like Abdul Carter and Micah Parsons as off-ball linebackers before moving them to edges, and then they end up being elite or have the potential to be elite edges in the NFL. So even defensive coordinators can, there's a lot of moving parts in an NFL game, and if they were grading, they might grade a little bit different than a PFF grader, and they might think that he has a different kind of skill set that might translate again for very specific situations. So it's folks like him where he's not clearly a free safety or clearly a box safety, or even a Budda Baker that we were talking about before, where it's like a 40-40-20 split in terms of box snaps, free safety snaps, and slot snaps, where we wish that they were closer, because we've seen all the stuff that Budda Baker, for instance, can do when he's close to the line of scrimmage. But there could be circumstances and situations and personnel groupings that might lead to different preferences.
And I think this is a great segue here, Scott. Before we sign off, where are you at with the NFL season right now? Where are you at with fantasy, like management and things like that? Any like words of wisdom for us novices out here listening to the professor helping us out here, helping us get our fantasy wins?
Yeah, and I completely forgot to mention this when you teed me up for the question, that I am a current defensive coordinator for the 10 and under New York Jets of flag football in Lexington, where I make those adjustments. And sometimes, I play some guys in safety when I should have them at linebacker. And, our last game, they were doing a lot of dinking and dunking. So I moved our safeties into linebackers to try to intercept some passes, and still didn't end up working out. So, even the best minds sometimes make mistakes. But in terms of...
I'm going to look up Theo's PFF metrics right now. I'm going to pull those up quick while you're talking. So
in terms of advice, I'm a big proponent of draft offense and stream defense, with the exception of linebackers, because linebackers, you only stream linebackers when there's injuries, and even they get gobbled up super fast unless there's a ton of uncertainty, and you can get both the guys in Indy who might be playing instead of Carlis, and it turns out neither of them end up being the guy. But when it comes to corners, when it comes to safeties, when it comes to defensive tackles in particular, defensive ends to a little bit lesser of an extent, you can find, if you look at your top performing players through 3 weeks, a whole lot of guys that you didn't have to invest a lot of draft capital in. If you flip to the offensive side of the ball, you don't see quite as much of that. You still see variability in offensive players. Like, I go absolutely nuts when people talk about, oh, look at all of the variance and unpredictability of IDP versus offense. And, you still see Malik Neighbors going out and having a terrible game from time to time, and lots of, name your highly touted offensive players. AJ Brown in week 1 and week 2, when I started getting ridiculous trade offers for him in my dynasty leagues of like a third and then somebody for AJ Brown. Like, get out of here. So I always like to trade for offense, draft offense, and then recognize that the curve is a lot flatter when it comes to most IDP positions, again, with the slight exception of linebacker. But Jake and I did a whole episode about that, about drafting LB early versus DL early. And I was very much on the LB early side of it. So be flexible, be fluid, but never undervalue the importance of offense, because it's a scarcity game. And again, it's a flattening of the curve when you look at the IDP performances compared to the offensive performances.
And I think that's kind of been the mantra for the last couple seasons. If you listen to the show, if you're a follower of the show, you'll hear that, we can find pieces later, tonight on the show, for example, Dee Winters, right up until, start of the preseason, or before the start of the regular season, even in preseason, like, he was a name that you could probably get on the cheap or even off your waiver wires. And now look at where we are week 3. He's a top performer. Week 4, we're looking at him to really do great rest of the season. So I truly support that theology or the ideology of that kind of whole work there, Scott. So what are you working on right now, and where can good folks find some more of your work?
So right now I'm working on my DL streaming every week. And, one of the fun things I'm doing this week, I'm still tracking my performance. So you can see week to week how I'm doing in terms of players that are successful for you or unsuccessful, averages by groupings, because I always rank the streaming options into various groups. But another fun thing that I'm doing this year is I'm also tracking my 20 streamers each week against the top 20 expert consensus according to Fantasy Pros heading into the season. So exactly how much it's costing you to stream if you're looking at the average streamer performance versus the average top player performance. And so far, kind of so good. You're obviously losing a little bit by streaming, but so far through 3 weeks, there's a 2.2 difference between playing studs and streaming defensive line. If you look at just those sort of top tier plays, the difference shrinks to 0.04 points per game. So those top streaming options versus those very top options that you had to take at the top of your IDP drafts. When it comes to defensive linemen, it's a fun thing to be tracking, and it's nerve wracking. I'm honestly monitoring that as much, if not more closely, as my fantasy matchups from week to week, and then revising the model and trying to do the best I can to test that out. So every week I send that out on Wednesdays, 20 names that are rostered in less than 50%, oftentimes less than 25% of IDP leagues across Sleeper and MFL. I'm going to be on IDP bets with Johnny next week. So it'll be all sack props, because that's all I do when I'm on there, because I absolutely love it and love looking at those one-on-one matchups and where sacks have been coming from and what quarterbacks have been running into pressure. So looking forward to doing that. And I'm also really excited to be launching the next iteration of the State of IDP survey. So every year I do a survey of the IDP community to get a sense of how we all play this fantasy game that we love so much. In past years, it had taken a few minutes per league because I wanted to learn as much about your leagues as I can. Now, thanks to some primary data that we've been able to get on league settings, the survey is incredibly short, and it's only one survey per person. So it just asks things like, how many IDP leagues do you play in? Where do you play in them? And just some baseline things like that I share with the entirety of the IDP community. So that way, anyone who says they're out there making content to help you, they can know more about what exactly it is that you play and how you play. So it's going to be a really, I think right now it's at maybe 5 questions and should take maybe 2 minutes per person instead of 3 minutes per league, as it has been in the past. So really, really excited about the launch of that survey and to see just how many folks we can hear from to, again, learn more about the community to try to improve what everyone's doing in this space.
And Scott, when can we expect to help you out with that survey? When would that be out?
Yeah, so hoping to launch that probably end of next week at when IDP Bets also drops. I'll be promoting it through my articles. You'll see a link in all of my DL streaming articles for it. I know the guys are going to talk about it from time to time. It'll be on Twitter. I'll put it on Reddit. I think there's a IDP Facebook group, and I'll try to get it out anywhere I can, because again, this isn't something that I'm doing for me or for the site, even though you can win a paid membership to the site as a thank you for doing this. But it's really just something that I'm doing because I'm an academic. The professor IDP thing isn't just some kind of shtick. I'm a researcher by trade, and I hear lots of people say lots of things about IDP fantasy and how people play it or how many people play it and all these things. I'm like, that's an empirical question. Let's get some data, and then let's be more educated, and let's make this a better community, and let's make better content creators for this community. And the best way we can do that is by learning how people play.
Right. And as a person who produces content, it's a really useful tool because you want to kind of make yourself marketable, and you want to make what you're creating useful to your consumers. And if you're making something that they can't use, then you can become irrelevant. And so I appreciate that from a creation of content perspective too, Scott. So All right. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of the IDP After Show. I want to thank Scott again for coming on. Happy birthday to Theo, sharing some fantastic knowledge about the game we all love. Be sure to follow him and catch all of his great content that he does for the IDP show, and be sure to help him out with that survey coming out next week. Speaking of following, if you're not doing so already, please make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. And so that way we know that you are getting everything that you can from the IDP perspective. Join me next week as John Glosser from Dynasty Nerds joins me, and we talk about our callouts for week 5. Enjoy the games this week. We get our first round of international games as well as 2 Monday night games. So for Scott and myself, I say thank you for joining us, and best of luck to you and your teams in week 4. Until next time, take care.
This was the IDP After Show.